I'm Bob Krieg, and we're looking today at the life of actually two people, Franz Jägerstätter and his wife Franziska Jaegerstaetter. And one of the reasons that they're not better known in the English-speaking world is that's okay. It's because their last name is hard to pronounce, and so it's hard to proclaim a saint if you can't pronounce the saint's last name. But anyway, I think we have two saints here. I mean, in this, we have many saints in this room, but anyway, John's going to introduce me, and then I'll start.
I'm sorry, I'm late for the introduction. Welcome to the Institute for Church Life and to Saturdays with the Saints. And really, friends, what better way is there to spend Saturday than with the Saints? And that's not really a rhetorical question, because if you think about it, Saturday is the ancient Sabbath. And the ancient Sabbath in both Jewish and Christian spiritual literature is considered an image of eternity. And so, in a way, literally, we will be spending Saturday with the Saints. So, how's that? Not every lecture series can make that happen. That's a foretaste of eternity. Friends, Robert A. Krieg is professor of theology here at the University of Notre Dame. Bob has been a member of the faculty of theology for over 35 years. And he has a list of distinguished publications befitting someone of such long-standing scholarly commitment. His classic book, Story-Shaped Christology, is still in print 25 years from its original publication. But since then, he has also published Karl Adam, Catholicism and German Culture, Romano Guardini, precursor of Vatican II, Catholic Theologians in Nazi Germany, that was 2004, and in 2005, he translated and edited with commentary, Romano Guardini, Spiritual Writings. Apropos, even more apropos of today's lecture, in 2009, he translated, with commentary, Franz Jägerstätter, Letters and Writings from Prison. And Bob's scholarship has been supported by grants, major grants, from the Luce Foundation and also from the Louisville Institute. But before inviting Bob to begin, I'd like to point out another very special publication. This is his most recent book, from 2013, Treasure in the Earth, Salvation in the Bible and in Our Lives. This book is the gathered fruit of Bob's 35 years of teaching undergraduate students our first course in theology. It's well worth reading for anyone who wants to know what is on the minds of young people and what moves them spiritually and intellectually. For there probably is no more beloved and accomplished teacher of this course than Bob Krieg. Friends, Bob will speak to us this morning on the topic, Blessed Franz Jägerstätter, Farmer, Conscientious, Objector, and Martyr. So please join me in welcoming Professor Krieg.
Thank you, John. I'm happy to do this, and what I'd like to do is to go for 10 minutes and then see if you have a question or two, and then do another 10 minutes and then another 10 minutes, and so we should be wrapping up in 45 minutes with a couple little intersperses for questions. The outline of my presentation is right here. I would like to talk about both Franz, who died in August 1943, and his wife Franziska, who lived beyond him for another 70 years. She died 2 weeks after her 100th birthday. I'm sorry it's so light here. But anyway, so she just died in March. And so when he died, he was 36 years old, and she was 30 years old. And she did not know exactly when he died until she received word a week or two later from the chaplain who escorted Franz to his execution at the guillotine in Berlin. When I think of both of their lives, I think of the line from John's Gospel, the powerful verse, "Unless a grain of wheat falls into the earth, it remains just a single grain, but if it dies, it bears much fruit." Both of them, in very different ways, were single grains who, in the course of their lives, died time and again and bore much fruit in their children and in the impact that they had on people's lives. Most people they didn't even know. When Franz Jägerstätter died in August of 1943, he thought maybe only 20 people knew what he was witnessing to and why he was there. He went to his death alone, except with the chaplain, and no one was there for his burial except the chaplain went along with the soldiers who had his cremated his remains in an urn, which they buried in a public cemetery in a corner in Berlin. So first about Franz, and then about his impact after his death, and then about Franziska. I'll start with an anecdote. On the sheets you have there, you see that Franz Jägerstätter in right in the middle of the page, Franz Jägerstätter receives military induction notice in February of 1943, February 22nd, 1943. And what that means, he has to report to Linz and be inducted into the army. Well, they had already been through basic training and then had a deferment, and he knew, having had a chance to think about it and seen what basic training was about and listened to stories coming back from the Eastern Front and the fall of Stalingrad in January of 1943, he knew that he could not allow himself to take any oath to Hitler. And so when he said goodbye to Franziska on that morning in February, he and she knew that she may never see him again. He goes to the draft office, he reports in, and they immediately arrest him. He's held in a military prison in Linz, Austria, until May. So he celebrates Easter in prison. And then they take him under guard to Berlin. They put him in the Tegel Berlin prison. He has no idea as to what's going to happen. They never say, here's what's going to happen next. All of a sudden, after being in this cell, he's moved and he's taken to Berlin. And on July 13th, he's taken from his solitary cell, put in a van, and taken to another prison. He doesn't know whether he's going to get executed or what. And he walks into a room, and Franziska, whom he has not seen since February, is there waiting for him, along with the pastor who came with her on the overnight train from Austria. She'd never been away from their little farming region in Austria, and all of a sudden, there she is in Berlin in this military prison in an interview room, and they're told they have 20 minutes to visit. She's brought him a basket of food. She wants to give him some food. The guard steps in and takes the basket. They have this brief exchange, she afterwards is forced to leave the room, not knowing will she ever see him again. He has no idea what's going to happen next. He's put back in the van. He's taken back to the prison. She, that night, with the pastor, gets on a train in Berlin, and by the next morning, she's back at her farm in Austria. And she has no idea what comes next. What comes next is 1 month later, he's taken out of his cell early in the morning, and on the back of your letter, on the back of your sheet is the letter he writes to her as he's waiting to be executed. He had not been allowed to communicate at all with her after he had seen her in the room. And it's hard for me not to read some of this without crying, so I won't read it. When I was translating these letters from German into English, I'd get up early in the morning and I'd be sitting at the kitchen table translating into English some of these letters between Franziska and Franz. And my wife Liz would come down and I'd be crying. It was hard not to. I mean, you just read this. Greetings in God, dearest wife, and all my loved ones. your letters of July 13th, which she wrote that night as she was getting back on the train, and July 25th still bring me joy. I'm grateful for them. 4 weeks ago today, we saw each other for the last time on this earth. This is an image of Franziska at the age of 94 as proceedings were beginning for the beatification of her husband. What a wonderful countenance. Just a lovely, lovely woman. And I never had a chance to meet her, but anyone who did just said, you just felt you were in the presence of grace to be with her. She raised her 3 daughters, also a daughter that he had had prior to their marriage outside of wedlock. And she was involved closely with the raising not only, therefore, of her 3 daughters, but from time to time she would take in his daughter, his other daughter, 4th daughter. So Franz Jägerstätter, on the chronology, so on side 1 of this, his own life, he himself is born outside of wedlock in 1907 in an impoverished part of Austria, in the upper Austria, which is not too far from Munich and Salzburg, but even today I think a little difficult to get to. His mother eventually marries Franz Jägerstätter. Franz's birth father dies in the First World War. In 1921, Franz, at the age of 14, completes school, and that's the end of his formal education. But he becomes an avid reader because his mom has married Heinrich Jägerstätter, who's a farmer, but who has developed a big library and receives newspapers. How could this be? In this little village, 500 people in the Austrian backwaters, and so Franz no longer has public education, but he's reading history in the library of his stepfather. He himself has a pretty wild youth, and so he gives birth to his first daughter, Hildegard, and he and his daughter's mother never marry, but they remain in close contact and great respect to one another throughout his whole life. Even when he's in prison, she sends him notes. And she becomes close with his wife, Franziska. Life is complex. He eventually meets Franziska in 1936. She is 6 years younger than he is, and a year after they're married, they have their first daughter. And soon after that, as Hitler is about to annex Austria, Franz has a dream. And in this dream, a train is weaving its way from Germany through the Alps into Austria. And when the train gets into Austria, people are running towards the train. Let's get on this train, the train being an image of Nazism and the Third Reich. And in the dream, Franz is standing there watching everybody run towards the train, and a voice says to him in his dream, "This train is going to hell." And it shapes his conscience for everything he does from that point on, and he's convinced that it is his conscience. It's not just his own voice, and that it's God speaking to him, and that he has to be true to his conscience. Now, a bit extraordinary thing about that is, since Vatican II, since 1965, there's been a lot of literature about conscience. But in the 1920s and 30s and 40s and 50s, in Catholicism, there was not much about conscience. You basically trusted that the authorities, whether in the state or in the church, could help you make up your minds, or your pastor. The emphasis on informed conscience is something that he discovers as he's reading, because there are some writers, Romano Guardini, who are beginning to rediscover the importance of conscience in the Christian moral life. So his conscience is shaped by this dream, and when the plebiscite comes, when 96% of the Austrians, frequently because of fear of their jobs, voted for Hitler, Franz Jägerstätter in his little village is the only one who says no. Pretty gutsy right there. Another daughter is born. Hitler invades Poland, starting the Second World War in September 1939. The third daughter with Franziska is born, and then in June of 1940, Franz reports for basic military training. Let me show you some slides, get you up to date. He's grown up on, this is his picture of his farm. I don't know who, he's in front of the bicycle. And on his farm, that's his farmhouse. We'll see a picture of it later on in a second. And he has ridden a motorcycle ever since he was a teenager. So when he's in basic training, they put him into the transport corps to drive trucks and motorcycles. This is his picture in uniform in 1940 in Enns, Austria. And this is his wife, Franziska, and his mother on the right with two of his daughters. And this is him on a visit, on leave during basic training. He goes back, and there's his mother and his three daughters. And I think that's Franziska who's standing up to the right. Here he's practicing his motorcycle exercises. During this time, he's writing letters back to Franziska, and he says, sometimes I think this is a joke. At other times, I'm just so scandalized, I know I cannot do this. He and she apply for a deferment so he can go back to the farm on the excuse that the Austrian people need some people to stay on the farms and grow things, and so he gets a deferment. And so he goes back to the farm, and he has from, on the sheet you can see here, from April 1941 until February of 1943, he's back on the farm. During that time, and only Franziska knows this, he is writing on pieces of paper his reflections, which turn out to be a series of short essays on what's happening in Austria, what's happening in the war, what's happening in the Catholic Church. And among other things, he says, the reason given for us to go in and to invade the Soviet Union and confront Stalin, the reason is we're told that that's a heathen society and that it's persecuting the church. What's happening under Hitler, he says. And meantime, as he's writing, he's in conversations with priest friends, pastors who themselves are resisting and are putting in time in prison or being deprived of their parishes and being forced to go into semi-retirement. So he has the witness of some of Austrian priests who are, as he's trying to sort out his conscience, they themselves are saying, here's what we've done. On the other hand, they're saying to him, but we don't have a wife and children and a farm and a mother who's been suffering from cancer. Anyway, after the fall of Stalingrad, and also Hitler has some defeats in North Africa, in February of 1943, Hitler insists that they have a big call-up of more people because they lost 600,000, 700,000 Third Reich soldiers just at Stalingrad. They lost 750,000 soldiers at Stalingrad. So Hitler says, we need to get more soldiers. So that's why Franz is recruited. But when he goes to prison, he's sitting in the prison in Linz, and his wife is able to send him this picture of the three daughters at Easter time. They're dressed in their Easter apparel. In May, he's taken to this prison. He's kept there. He has no idea from one day to the next what's going to happen. He is able to, a guard sneaks in paper and pencil, and he's able to write like a diary and reflections on Scripture. He has a Bible. And all this stuff eventually gets sent to Franziska, who keeps it hidden until she lets some of it out in the 1960s. I'm jumping ahead, but I'll get to that. So nobody knows he's been writing these things. Nobody knows he has these essays hidden at his little farmhouse in Austria. In the morning of August 9th, he gets up. He's told, we're going to Brandenburg prison, and there the military tribunal will rehear your case. He gets there, and he's told that by noon he'll know what the story is. That's on the back of the sheet. And he's told at 4 o'clock we're going to begin the execution of all of you. There are 12 or 13 men who are being executed. And he's the first, and he's guillotined. Pretty powerful, huh? Meantime, Franziska's back in Austria on the farm. And the chaplain sends her a letter the next day and says, one of the holiest persons he'd ever met had just died. Okay, so that's his life. His posthumous impact. But before I switch to that, any thoughts or corrections? I'm not good on dates. My family says, you got a great idea, but let's get some dates. You know, so, any things I might have left out that are important dates or need to be corrected. Okay, with regard to his, oh yes.
Was his family threatened when he refused induction?
They kept it secret. So most people in the village didn't know what was happening. Those who did know were these priests and some close friends. But as people did begin to find out that he wasn't on the front, they began to have questions, and she and the children began to be shunned. And in fact, that's the story of the next 40 years after he's executed, is that she goes for, until the beatification process begins in the middle 1990s, she and her daughters are under a cloud. Because so many Austrian families lost husbands, sons, members of their families, that it's inconceivable that they should also show respect for someone who refused to fight. So in 1946, the chaplain who had been with him takes the urn, gets permission to take the urn from the cemetery in Berlin and brings it back to the parish church, St. Radegund, in the village of St. Radegund, and they have a special ceremony to bury the urn. But not very many people show up, because from their point of view, he's a traitor. And one of his close friends, who had been a pastor, asked the bishop if this pastor, who himself had put in time in prison, could write an article in the Linz newspaper, Catholic newspaper, post-war, 1946-47, about Jägerstätter and his witness to Christ. And the bishop says, no, this will be too confusing and painful for all those people who are now living without their husbands, their sons, their brothers, their uncles. So he's not known. Yes?
1921, last year in school, but his stepfather has a lot of newspapers and stuff. This is when the Russian Civil War is going on, and the Bolsheviks had murdered millions of Christians. What did the average Austrian and Franz himself know about what was going on in the Soviet Union and what the Bolsheviks were doing many years before they became power?
Yeah, right. Yeah, I don't quite know. I think he was more informed than most because he was a reader. You know, if there's a way, I keep wanting to say to students, reading will give you a lot of freedom, but it's a lot of work. Anyway, I'm going to push on, and then we'll come back. Don't forget your question. This is the gravesite as developed today at the parish church in St. Radegund. And so his urn is buried there. At the time of his beatification ceremony at the church in Linz, some bone fragments were taken from the urn there and brought to the church at Linz. And this is the plaque in his honor, and it says, as I say here, Franz Jägerstätter, farmer at Leer, which is the name of the farm, and sexton. He was a sacristan, a church sexton, during the time he was not in the military. And then it says, buried originally in Brandenburg and reburied in September 1946. Whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. What does it gain a person if he gains the whole world but forfeits his life? There was a dispute in the village as to whether he should be allowed to be buried there and whether his name should even be on the side of the church with all those who died fighting for Hitler's army. And after the plaque is put up, it's defaced. So meantime, Franziska is living through this, as are his daughters. So 1943, he dies. 1946, he's buried in his parish church. From 1946 until 1964, little is known about him in Austria or the German-speaking world. He only comes to prominence in 1964 because a Catholic peace activist teaching in Loyola Chicago, Gordon Zahn, is interested in seeing how Catholics responded to Hitler and has been traveling through Austria and Germany, and he learns about Franz Jägerstätter as being one of the few Catholic laymen who was martyred under Hitler. And Gordon Zahn goes to a little village, interviews Franziska, who's reluctant to tell him very much or give him very much. She gives him a few of the letters and a little bit of the essays, and he has to handwrite them. There's no photocopying or faxing or anything. And Gordon Zahn comes back and he writes a book entitled In Solitary Witness. And this book shapes the consciences of a lot of Catholics who are wondering about the war in Vietnam. It becomes soon translated into German, and all of a sudden the German-speaking people are saying, who was this guy? So he had remained completely 95% unknown until Gordon Zahn is part of the Catholic Peace Fellowship connected with Dorothy Day and the Catholic Worker Movement. Says, we've got to find out about these women and men under Hitler who stood up to the authoritarian rule. And with that, his book is read by Daniel Ellsberg. Daniel Ellsberg is a psychiatrist who's been hired by the Pentagon to study what's going on in Vietnam. And Daniel Ellsberg realizes that the president and the government in the 1970s are now lying to the American people about what's happening in Vietnam and what the Pentagon actually knows and has done there. And Daniel Ellsberg is married. One of his sons is by the name of Robert. Daniel Ellsberg takes his sons with him, photocopies this secret report, and releases it to the media, the Pentagon Papers of 1971, knowing that he's going to get arrested. When interviewed, he says, my conscience told me to do it, and I was inspired by Franz Jägerstätter. Can you imagine? Franz Jägerstätter dies in 1943 in a little cell in Berlin, thinking nobody's ever going to know about me. And all of a sudden, he's shaping American attitudes about the Vietnam War. The Holy Spirit's alive and well. You know? Daniel Ellsberg is arrested. He's in prison for a while, but his case is tossed out. The Supreme Court and says that he cannot be indicted, that that because of the clear disparity between the truth of the documents and the government's behavior, there's no case against him. But he and his family have to live for a number of years, 3 or 4 years, with the uncertainty as to whether he was going to spend his life in prison. Daniel Ellsberg. Okay. His son, Robert Ellsberg, goes on to become a writer and a publisher, and a number of years ago becomes the editor-in-chief of Orbis Books, run by Mary Knoll Order in New York. And Franz Jägerstätter's papers, as part of his beatification process, had been published finally in German in 2007. Robert Ellsberg hears about this. He knows of Franz Jägerstätter because he knew Franz Jägerstätter's witness had influenced his dad, and Robert, remembers photocopying all these papers. So as editor-in-chief of Orbis Books, he contacts Erna Putz, who's been working closely with Franz Jägerstätter's wife, Franziska, and he says, we're going to get a hold of the German copy. I need somebody who can translate it into English, and he knows I've been dabbling with different stuff in German. He hears about this. Anyway, out of the blue, I get a call from him saying, would I be interested in translating all this stuff? I felt like a pot of gold had been put in my hand. This has been one of my heroes. I had read Gordon Zahn's book in 1964 because I was a Catholic kid having questions about Vietnam. So it's like, how does this happen? You know? Anyway, so that's how. So Daniel Ellsberg, Franz Jägerstätter, Robert Ellsberg. Amazing. Let's see where we are on these slides. Gordon Zahn is crucial in this whole thing. He does not live to be there for the beatification of Franz. This is the family home today. It's now, I think, basically a museum. And this is the beatification process. Thoughts or questions before I speed on here? There was one over here.
You know, in your book's called In Solitary Witness, is there any evidence that he had any connection? Well, first of all, did he see himself as a pacifist? And did he have any connection with any other groups that either resisted Hitler, refused to cooperate with Hitler, or that saw themselves as pacifists, especially within the Catholic faith? Was there any connection there, or was he so remote that he really was doing this just completely on his own?
Right. The only support he had was from these 6 or 8 priests who themselves were parish priests in rural parts of Austria and who themselves had put in time in prison. But there was no official network, and some of them continued to write to him when he was in prison. So he had their support. But I think it is right to say solitary witness in that he's not getting any official support from the Catholic Church. And we could say, what's going on there? There's a lot of layers. One is that when he goes to talk to his bishop about what he should do, the bishop is unsure whether Franz is for real or whether he's a spy. Because it was known that the Nazis would set up someone to go in and tell a pastor or a bishop, you know, I'm having problems with all this, what do you think? And then the pastor would say, yeah, you're right. These folks are, we've got to reject Hitler and the whole movement. Patricia.
This is why, you know, the idea of a network which would exist. What is known here is, for example, the White Rose. That movement started to be conceptualized in July. The first decapitations happened in February. There was no time to build up a movement. The Gestapo was deadly efficient in this point, and therefore to have the idea that there would be a network where people exchange ideas, they didn't let it happen, you know, they couldn't. It was quite fast, you know, the leaflets were distributed starting in December, January, February was end.
And this is all 1943, you're saying?
Of course, what it
Yeah, all because of the fall at Stalingrad. One other thing, though, which is also important to note with Franz Jägerstätter is Gordon Zahn's book comes out during Vatican II. Gordon Zahn is invited to Rome by Catholic pacifists, Catholic Peace Fellowship. He meets with some of the people who are working on the document that comes out to be Gaudium et Spes. He explains Franz Jägerstätter that Franz Jägerstätter had a hard time because there is such a vacuum of literature for Catholics on conscientious objection. And Gordon Zahn convinces these bishops and their advisors to include in Gaudium et Spes strong statements in support of conscience in general and conscientious objection to war in particular. And they do it. Here he is. He dies in 1943, and he is shaping the thought of Catholics in Vatican II and in Gaudium et Spes today. Sean.
It's worth noting that Gordon Zahn was a conscientious objector to World War II from the American side. He was interned during World War II, and it was part of when he had heard of Franz Jägerstätter. There was a sense of wanting to connect with another Catholic conscientious objector across the battle lines. And he was later found difficulty getting hired and getting published because of the research that he was doing on the German Catholics.
Yeah.
And then at the end of his life, he said he wasn't able to be at the beatification, but he was at St. Camilla's Hospital in Wisconsin and learned of word of the beatification before he died. He wasn't very lucid at the end of his life, but when he was told that Franz was to be beatified, he did have a moment of lucidity.
Isn't that great? Yeah. Again, yeah, the seed falls to the ground, you know, and that we all do it in different ways, not knowing what our impact will be. Franz's beatification process concludes in October 26 with this grand ceremony in the cathedral in Linz. And I'd like to just comment on a few things there. After the Second World War, Franz Jägerstätter, even after the defeat and the German recognition by the German people and German government of the failure and the horror of the Nazi regime, Franz Jägerstätter was still listed as a traitor, legally. They didn't have the documents that were being held in the Soviet Union to give background to his case. So Franziska Jägerstätter is deprived of government financial support because her husband has been a traitor. So some of the health care benefits for her and for her daughters, she's deprived those. And what changes it all is the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. Because when the wall goes down, all of a sudden, archives that are from the Second World War are now accessible. And in the archives in Prague, they find documents concerning Franz Jägerstätter. In Prague, you want to say, how do they get from Berlin to... I don't know. No one knows. I mean, they're found there. And it explains the whole government case against him, that he was executed because he was demoralizing the military. His witness was a demoralization for fighting for Hitler, and therefore he was a threat. And so in 1990, the German court lifts his death sentence. That opens the way for Franziska to be eligible for government support. It also gets the Catholic Church more interested in looking at Franz Jägerstätter. And the Diocese of Mainz begins the beatification process. And here are some pictures of the ceremony. And you can see his picture up in the background there. Did anybody here get to go to that? Because there are people there were groups that went. But I kept waiting for my department chairman, John Cavadini. But no. He did a lot of wonderful things for me, so I'm just teasing. Yeah, he had to teach Patricia Bellum. Okay. This is her at the ceremony as she's arriving at the church. His 4 daughters were there. even the one who was born outside of wedlock. She's treated, and had been all along, treated as a member of the family. Here she's carrying the urn down the aisle. A little story. When she got there, she was told that she would process down the aisle, and then the bishop and one of his assistants would carry the urn down. As I understand it, she said, "No, thank you. I'll carry it down." So they changed the ceremony at her insistence, and she carried her husband's remains down the aisle. She has a mind of her own, or had a mind of her own. And here she is handing the urn over to the Bishop of Linz. And so today there's a place in the cathedral in Linz that has one urn with some of his bone fragments, and then at the village of St. Radegund is the other urn with the rest of his remains. And then after the ceremony, the urn, many people go back to St. Radegund, and this is the church today. And there's a gathering there. An anecdote, and then I'm going to ask Patricia Bellum, who has studied with me and knows in many ways better than I do some background here. I've asked her to read a letter that Franziska wrote to the pastor who had contacted her after the death of her husband. But this little anecdote. In 1996, she's invited to go to Rome to be there for the beatification of a priest who had also been martyred, an Austrian priest. And she goes as a special guest of the Pope and of Cardinal Ratzinger to be part of this ceremony, because they're already starting to think about that her husband would be next in line for beatification. So she sees at this ceremony, and people who were the special guests are invited to go up to be greeted by Pope John Paul II. And she's sitting next to a young woman who's been asked to accompany her, and this young woman is very active in the Catholic Church in Austria, and is also very fluent in English, and therefore frequently writes articles for the London Tablet, the Catholic newspaper or journal in London. And this woman writes afterwards that as they're sitting in the pew and getting ready to go up for Franziska to be introduced to Pope John Paul II, Franziska leans over and whispers to her and says, "Do you think it would be all right if I made the sign of the cross on the Pope's forehead?" She's supposed to be getting the blessing. Isn't this great? And the young woman says to her, "I don't know, they have security guards." Isn't this great? They have security guards. I'm not so sure. And so the young woman says she's not so sure what's going to happen. She gets up there, and sure enough, Franziska reaches out and puts her hand on the Pope's forehead and gives him the sign of the cross. People just stand there, and the Pope allows it, who himself was pretty infirmed at that point, and a bit out of it. Okay, so they get back to the pew, and the young woman says to Franziska, "Are you okay? And is everything all right?" And Franziska whispered back to her and said, "I think the Holy Father liked this. People should do it more often." Well, in fact, what's the first thing that Pope Francis does? He goes out on the balcony and asks everybody to bless him. She anticipated what Francis was going to say. "I need the blessing," So Franziska obviously was a person of great faith who thought about things a lot. And Patricia, I'm going to ask you to read this letter because it's really touching. In this letter that she writes back in 1943 to the chaplain, she says she's already looking forward to being reunited with her husband in heaven. So I'll let Patricia read this to you.
Ich kann Ihnen versichern, dass unsere Ehe eine von den glücklichsten war in unserer Pfarre. Ich freue mich schon auf ein Wiedersehen im Himmel.
That was in German.
Oh, is it? Your Eminence, your dear letter with the comforting words has arrived. Many thanks for this. I thank you with my whole heart, especially for your frequent visits to my husband in prison. It surely brought him joy that he received comforting words in his cell from Christ's representative, and was also often able to receive the dear Jesus in Holy Communion. He was always concerned to follow the commandments. So it was no great sin that he did not obey the state, and I hope that with God's help he surely will have reached his eternal goal. This is painful for me, because I have lost a good husband and an exemplary father for my children. I can assure you that our marriage was one of the happiest in your parish. Many people envied us. However, the loving God has ordained things to be otherwise, and our beautiful union was lost. I already look forward to our reunion in heaven, where no war can any longer separate us. Once again, from the depths of my heart, I wish you God's reward for everything you have done for my dear husband. With the greatest respect, I send you greetings. Gratefully yours, Franziska Jägerstätter, St. Radegund, Post-Obermeeting ob Donau.
Isn't she articulate? My goodness. You'd asked about support, and I'll mention this one and then see if people have questions or comments. The chaplain in Berlin did bring news to Franz Jägerstätter during the last month or 6 weeks of his life that this Father Gap, this Austrian priest, was also in prison and would soon be executed. And that meant a lot to Franz, that he was not the only one from Austria, the only Catholic from Austria, whether he knew who was about to die. So he did say that meant a lot to him. And Franziska reported that afterwards, just to know that he was not so solitary that he was completely the odd person out. It's not known to me whether he knew of other people, for example, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, or other martyrs from the Protestant churches. He may have from the guards in the prison, but it sure meant a lot to him to know that there was a Catholic priest who also was a conscientious objector. Questions, thoughts, free associations? Need not be. Yes?
Can you tell me about the Catholic Church in Austria? What percentage of the population was Catholic?
What percentage of the Catholic Church in Austria was Catholic at that time? Yeah. No, probably 98%. Very high. And the Austrian hierarchy was similar to the German hierarchy, felt caught in the whole thing, because they saw it that their first responsibility was to keep the parishes operating so that people could have the sacraments, funerals. And they knew that in Germany under Bismarck in the 1870s, Bismarck had closed churches and people died or got married without the sacraments. And they said the sacraments are central to the Catholic life, and therefore we don't want to rock the boat so much that Hitler closes the parishes here in Austria. But does that then lead to turning a blind eye? So the bishops, by and large, said Hitler was elected legally, and the Catholic Church respects legal governments. Therefore, we leave it up to your consciences. Unfortunately, there was not much literature, though, about conscience. So I don't know if that's helpful to you. So the Catholics felt like sheep without shepherds. Would that be fair, Patricia? It's really simplistic to say that the church just capitulated. There were ways that they resisted, and that Catholics resisted by having processions for holy days. That was just it flew in the face of Hitler and the Third Reich to have a procession for Feast of Corpus Christi. But they only pushed resistance so far. Yes?
With the encyclical letter by Pius XI, Mitbrennen der Sorge, printed outside of Germany, smuggled into Germany, proclaimed at all the churches on Sunday of 1937, would that have had much of an influence, do you think?
On Franz? Yes. Yeah, Pope Pius XI did write this strong encyclical against Nazism that appeared, as Father says, in 1937, and pastors throughout Germany, and perhaps in Austria, the Austrians for sure knew of it and read it. All of them read this encyclical from their podiums in place of a homily on Sunday in 1937, and the Gestapo was irate and went into a lot of parishes and chanceries and destroyed offices and machinery, because Pius XI made it clear that Hitler was violating natural law and going against God's will in his racism and his singling out of certain people, especially Jews, for extermination. So the Jägerstätter knows of this letter. But the bishops, along with Pius XI and then Pius XII, didn't quite know what to do after that. So how do you implement the letter? Because if you as an individual Catholic tried to stand up, you knew that for sure you were going to lose your job. You knew for sure that your family would be somehow persecuted, whether it was in Germany or Austria. And also, it's hard for us in our society to imagine this. You just didn't talk with other people about what was going on because you never knew who was going to turn you into the Gestapo. We take it that freedom of expression for granted, but they couldn't even talk between husbands and wives for fear that their children would hear them and say something in school, because that happened, right, Patricia? Yeah, children would report their parents just for saying, we don't think it was such a good idea to invade Stalingrad. Didn't take much to say that was going to be a mistake, because Napoleon had tried to take the Soviet Union and it failed. And Hitler sets off to the Soviet Union, and a lot of Germans are going, this is going to be the beginning of the end. And from our point of view, the beginning of the end is D-Day, 1944. But from the point of view of the Germans, the beginning of the end is Stalingrad's defeat of the German Fifth Army under General Paulus, and Paulus's surrender. Because, as I mentioned earlier, all of a sudden, 750,000 German soldiers are either dead or in prison camps in Siberia, not to return. So Catholics and Protestants as well had a hard time knowing how to resist. Yes, go ahead.
How did Francesca support herself and her children?
Ran the farm. In her letters, she keeps, at the start, she writes to Franz and says, what do you usually do with that well when it runs dry? And she has to wait a couple of weeks. He could only write her every couple of weeks and then only once a month. So she runs the family farm, shovels the manure. Isn't that extraordinary? We're just about out of time. One last observation. Yes?
Presumably he had some kind of deepened conversion prior to the events of 38. What were some of the things that kind of led to that, his own conversion, such that he was ready to respond in this way?
I think people attribute the birth of his daughter, the first daughter outside of wedlock, to all of a sudden him going through a whole period of soul searching about his wild life and about the responsibility he now had to this child, and that he couldn't even think of marrying the daughter's mother, in part because he didn't have much to live on. He wasn't sure he could support her. So that's the closest we have to him talking about what brought this about. There's no, at least to my knowledge, there's no document where he talks about a conversion experience. That's a good question. Okay, thank you. John?